Mr. President.
Senators recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to suspend the quorum call.
Without objection.
I also ask unanimous consent to receive permission to complete my remarks before any vote is conducted.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I came to the floor several days ago in connection with the expiring national security provisions. We've got three provisions of our national security system of laws that are set to expire and have been set to expire for a long time. In fact, they expired yesterday, the 15th of March. We've known that this was going to happen for a long time. When the USA Freedom Act was passed in 2015, a bill that I authored along with my distinguished friend and colleague, Senator Leahy from Vermont, we knew that those three provisions, known as Lone Wolf, 215, and roving wiretaps, would expire at the end of 2019. We got to the end of 2019, and we found ourselves up against a spending cliff, and the Senate decided, with the concurrence of the House of Representatives and the President, that we should postpone until March 15th the expiration of those three provisions that I just mentioned. I came to the floor on Thursday to raise concerns that we needed to be able to amend and reform these provisions of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, or FISA, for a number of reasons. Among other reasons, I noted that the President of the United States found that his own rights as an American citizen were abused, as this law was manipulated, was abused in an unholy alliance of partisan political interests against him. For that reason, the President of the United States has, quite thankfully, made this point clear to the American people. Now, even though the abuses that we know of that occurred with respect to the President of the United States were not themselves one of these expiring provisions, we know that the law itself as a whole is subject to abuse, and that at moments like these, when these provisions are expiring, it's appropriate for us to take a broader look at the overall legal framework in which FISA operates and to bring about reforms. So I came to the floor on Thursday and I asked that we simply reauthorize these three expiring provisions for a period of a few weeks, that we reauthorize them cleanly and without any modification, to give us a few weeks to deal with the immediate crisis surrounding the coronavirus. And I asked that at the end of that period, we just proceed with the understanding that the Senate be allowed to vote on a small handful of amendments, proposed reforms to FISA. This unfortunately drew an objection, resulting in the expiration of these three provisions over the weekend. This was unnecessary. As I pointed out at the time, I and my bipartisan group of colleagues who have been concerned about these and other foreign intelligence surveillance provisions didn't necessarily want it to expire. In fact, we believed that this was an unnecessary step. It was unnecessary to allow the law to go through the uncertainty of an expiration without having something to put in its place. We could have and would have and should have done it differently. Fortunately, we were able to reach a deal that is still unfolding, but a deal that's about to be announced on the Senate floor, whereby we will be extending for a few weeks these three expiring provisions. And at the end of that time, we'll be able to vote on a small handful of provisions, amendments to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act framework. This is a necessary thing. We ought not wait until the President of the United States himself becomes a victim of this. When he has been a victim, we should assume that there are other victims, people whose rights have been invaded, violated, as the law has been abused. We know that to be the case, and for that reason, we've negotiated this agreement whereby we will be able to receive votes on amendments to improve and reform the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I want to thank President Trump for bringing this issue to the attention of the American people and for reminding them of the importance of reforming this law. I want to thank the lead co-sponsor of the legislation that I've filed in connection with this and of the amendments that we'll be considering. Pat Leahy from Vermont and I have worked on FISA-related issues for basically the entirety of the 9 years I've spent in the United States Senate. And so I'm grateful to him for working with me on this. I also want to point out that it shouldn't have to come to this. We shouldn't have to wait until the moment when we're on the eve of the expiration of some important legislation and where we have to wait for the President of the United States to weigh in and lean in and exercise as much leadership as he has to tell us that we ought to reconsider laws that we ourselves have enacted. From time to time, laws require revision and review and reform. That always necessarily requires amendments, and we ought to be ready, able, and willing to vote on amendments as necessary. Finally, this has become all too symptomatic of a Senate in which amendment votes, while once the norm, have now become the exception. This is unacceptable. It's not a partisan issue. This is neither Republican nor Democratic. It's neither liberal nor conservative. This is simply an American issue. The American people, including each of our constituents from each of the 50 states that we represent, deserve and expect for us to be more than a rubber stamp. We can't justify our pattern of waiting for legislation to come over from the House of Representatives and then accepting the highly flawed proposition that the House must have gotten it right, and we therefore must accept as a binary choice the entirety of what they've done without considering or voting on amendments. This isn't acceptable. We can do better. I'm encouraged that in this instance we've chosen to do better. I hope and expect and will continue to demand that we vote on more amendments, that this become the norm once again rather than the exception. Finally, I'm grateful that Senate leadership, Republican and Democratic alike, has chosen to allow us to consider amendments here. We're doing the right thing. And I look forward to more of precisely this kind of activity, not just voting on amendments pivotal to FISA, but also broader issues. This isn't just about FISA. This is about everything we do. The minute any of us ever hears an argument suggesting that we've got to accept whatever a handful of senators or a committee or the other House of Congress has proposed, and we ought to accept it or deny it lock, stock, and barrel without amendment, it is almost always an injurious and a dangerous argument, one that runs contrary to the very purpose for which this body exists. So I'm grateful for this opportunity that we're going to have to vote on these amendments. And I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.